Techniques we've been using are really modern surveying techniques, basically. In 2007, part of the land was surveyed from an aircraft using a laser instrument. So at that time, they measured the shape of the landscape, the shape of the rivers, the shape of the hills in really high detail. And since then, we've been coming back with a LiDAR instrument, a 3D laser scanner instrument that sits on a tripod and can be moved around the landscape. And we use that to make very, very high detailed maps of elevation, so maps of the topography. And what we've seen is that every year in the summer when these floods come through, the energy is being reduced by the structures, but also the sediment is being deposited. And so these formerly very deep, incised arroyos that acted like, very efficient plumbing that forced the water through a very narrow part of the landscape and out. Now the sediment is being deposited, the river channel beds are actually raising, the elevation is going up, and the water is flowing across the landscape in a wider pattern. That can be really, really beneficial to the landscape. And so we're measuring the amount of sediment, which is, a really staggering amount of sediment comes down in these floods. And the sands and gravels and silts and clays are being deposited behind these gabion structures and these dams throughout the river system, and really reversing what has been occurring for the last 100 years, which is erosion of the channels. So the changes are profound, and they're measurable, and we understand where the sand and gravel is going, where the silt is going, and where the water is going in a way that wasn't really measured before. So it's the right way to monitor these things and understand how the hydrology and the geology really lead to the restoration of the ecology and the restoration of the land. So one of the things that the Austins have been working on is thinking about ways to manage the broader landscape, the desert region in general, for all the people that use it. And initially, when the Austins started doing their work, the folks downstream who live in Ejido were skeptical of what they were doing. They were afraid that there'd actually be less water available because of the restoration efforts upstream. And in fact, when you go down there now and talk to them after the Austins have been working for close to 15 years or so, they have seen that the water levels in their wells have stabilized, and they now have year-round water in their river.
Es que los gaviones pues no tapan el agua, ¿no? Porque es una filtración de agua nada más. O sea, si acaso que ensolva poquito, pero el agua se consume para abajo, pues sí, ya sale más adelante.
Perhaps some of these techniques that the Austins are using can be more broadly applied to stabilizing subsurface and surface water resources throughout other dry regions as well. It's been one of the most interesting things to learn about as we study this, is not just the local effects, but how these effects may really benefit people downstream and can lead to perhaps even a new approach to managing land and managing water resources on a much larger scale. So the work we've been doing in Mexico, some of the techniques we use really build on the sort of techniques that geologists like me have been using for many, many years. When you go down and you look at these arroyo channels, and you look at the banks that have been eroded, some of these channels are very deep, and you see these layers of sediment that are now exposed where the river has eroded, and you can see the history of the river, the story of the river. You can see in past times when it operated in a very different way than it operates now, where the water really spread across the land, watered the landscape, deposited lots of sand and silts, and you can read that history, and now we're able to go back in and make measurements of how the story is being updated year to year and flood to flood with these newer techniques where we actually can see the sand and silt being deposited. We can make these 3D laser scans before a rainy event, watch the flood go through with our hydrological sensors that measure the amount of water that moves through, and then go back with these survey devices, scan them again, and then make these very high-resolution, detailed maps of landscape change. We can see where erosion is occurring and where deposition is occurring, and we can understand the detail of how the geology is evolving day to day and event to event in modern times. And as we continue to monitor this work, we continue to measure the waters that come down the river, the floods, and the sediment deposition. We can think a little bit about what might happen in the future. And I think one of the things that's really important is that these sort of efforts are maintained, and the changes that have occurred need to be maintained, the structures need to be maintained, and what will continue to happen is more sediment will be deposited. Floods will continue to lose energy and provide more water across the landscape and into the subsurface. And in the future, what this is going to lead to is more surface and subsurface water availability throughout the year, and that's going to lead to, you know, regrowth of riparian vegetation, trees along the river, and perhaps even ultimately the regrowth of some of the former desert wetlands, the former cienagas that are now dry, and some of the grasslands that exist on the low-lying areas that are right next to the river channel. The more groundwater and the more surface water is available, the more plants and animals can come back.